Alright guys, it's jerningham here. There's some more news about the coronavirus on the BBC News, so I'm going to press play on the video. Let's go and press play. Westminster News and Sky Central News.
Joined now by the chair of the Health Committee for the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. You saw him there. What did you learn this morning?
Well, I think we learnt some very important new bits of information. First of all, that the virus has now moved from the contained stage to what the government calls the delay stage, the second stage, and they are doing very.
Ooh, we can zoom in. Look at this. Zoom in.
Known as the mitigate stage, and what that really means is that we have got to get our heads around the possibility of potentially 20% of the population getting this virus. That's the level of penetration in Hubei province in China, the epicenter of the virus.
There's my feet
so
again.
The government is having to make some very difficult decisions. First of all, they said this morning they're going to bring back, they're going to allow medical students who ordinarily wouldn't be able to operate as doctors until they qualified. If they're in their final year, they might be allowed to practice as doctors, and first year foundation year doctors also would be allowed to do things they previously might not have been allowed to do. That's a very significant step. And some big debates going on inside government about school closures as well.
Do you think the NHS can cope with 20% of the country getting coronavirus?
Well, no health system anywhere in the world can cope with a pandemic in a way that means it's completely business as usual. And Professor Whitty was very open about the fact that there may be some impact even on urgent treatment.
And
what it would mean, for example, for cancer patients. But what he said was that the impact at its height would be for about 3 weeks. And so if you get the timing of that 3 weeks right, if you're able to predict accurately when that 3 weeks starts and when it ends, then you can do an enormous amount to make sure that urgent treatment is protected, either because it happens before that or because it happens after that. But yes, there are going to be, impacts, particularly for people who have pneumonia and respiratory diseases where the pressures will be at their highest.
It doesn't help, though, does it, that we have 43,000 fewer nurses in the NHS than we need?
Well, we do need more nurses. We need more doctors. That's the only long-term way we're going to reduce the pressures on the NHS. The government's got plans for that, but I think it's important to say that, the scale of what may happen means that there's going to be pressure in health systems all over the world, and most people look at the NHS. In fact, there was an international study, an independent study done by Johns Hopkins University, amongst others, in the United States, that said that the UK had the second best prepared health system in the world for dealing with pandemics. And most countries that don't have an NHS would think this is one of the moments when it's very, very good to have one.
But the government is now changing its policy towards nursing and students, isn't it? It's funding 5,000 more student training places. It's giving nursing students 5,000 a year to help get staff to come back in. Do you accept that cutting bursaries when you were in charge was now an error?
Well, I never wanted to do that, and I fought against it, but I was told by the Treasury if I wanted an extra 8 billion for the NHS, that was going to have to be part of the deal. So I'm very pleased that policy has been changed. We have increased nurse training places by a quarter. There are other plans for 50,000 nurses. These are the only long-term way that we're going to reduce pressure on the NHS frontline. It's more doctors and more nurses.
But the vacancy rates are still really high, 15% in London, 16% for some mental health units.
That's why we urgently need these new 50,000 nurses that the government's promising.
What are you doing to protect yourself from coronavirus?
Well, I'm listening very carefully to the advice. I'm not a doctor myself, so I'm listening to what the doctors are telling us. And we heard some very important information from Professor Whitty at the Select Committee hearing, that, for example, the virus can potentially survive on a hard surface for up to 3 days. It's unlikely to survive that long. So it is incredibly important to wash your hands when you arrive from work or when you arrive home at the end of the day if you've been on public transport. Catching your sneeze in the tissue, bitting the tissue, washing your hands regularly, these are the things that will have the most impact in slowing the spread of the virus.
What about travel? Have you cancelled any travel plans?
Well, I was due to go to a conference in the United States this weekend. That was actually cancelled by the organisers. And I think there are going to be all sorts of short-term impacts that we start to see. Obviously, people are very worried after the news from Flybe this morning. And I know that the judgment call for the government is how you minimise the economic and social disruption whilst always making sure you're taking the decisions necessary to save people's lives.
Why do you think that our government's view on things like closing schools is so markedly different from Italy's?
Well, they are in a different phase of the virus. It's much more advanced in Italy than it is here. But we had a very good discussion at the Select Committee this morning about that. And this is now a live issue for ministers to decide. And the reason that it's a difficult judgment is because coronavirus doesn't seem to affect children as badly as vulnerable older people, but it seems like they can catch it and pass it on. So in that context, you might want to close a school to slow down the spread of the virus. But if you do that, you're then meaning that mums and dads might not be able to go to work because they've got to look after children. And some of those mums and dads could, for example, be doctors and nurses who we very much need to go to work in the NHS. So it's a very difficult judgment that ministers now have to take.
Or indeed, it could be the grandchildren that have to look after the children. Jonathan Hunt, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Jeremy Hunt, sorry, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, that's a speech from Jeremy Hunt speaking about coronavirus. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and catch you in the next one. Peace. And give it a like and a comment, why don't you, the first day.